Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Glass Prism podcast. My name is Firas Ali, and this show right here is about people, culture, and the science behind ideas you haven't considered before. This time around, it's just me and you, me behind the mic and you listening through your stereo device. Recently, I had a thought that led me down a rabbit hole, making me question many things around us that went a little bit like this. Are all my thoughts and ideas stemming from a source, an input? A prompt reality plopped in front of me to start thinking in a specific direction. Without getting too philosophical, what I mean is, if thinking is a process and that process requires something to think about, i.e. an input, then I just wondered how much of the inputs around me guide my thoughts down the wrong conclusions about life. So I started to think of the implications of this on my thoughts and by extension, my identity, my belief systems, and my principles. If thoughts are a result of external inputs, does it mean that if someone else controlled those inputs for me, could they manipulate me to thinking a certain way, believing lies and rumors, building up biases for certain things, and conditioning my lizard brain to react more aggressively to something without thinking straight? I mean, I don't need to look back that far to understand the extent of this issue. The most readily available and apt example of this is the media hysteria surrounding the recent global COVID pandemic. Examples are abundant, and your worldview and the thoughts you had and currently hold at this very moment regarding that pandemic heavily relied on who was feeding you the information about the efficacy of the vaccine, the danger this virus posed to society, and the economic fallout that ensued. As a result, the pandemic undressed the flawed public health, political, and economic systems that seemed to contradict each other. We saw a rise in conspiracies and a rise in those who would believe in them. In this particular case, and I'm sure many more cases that I have not been observant enough to realize, it seems one of two things are true. Either our world leaders cannot agree on the truth of the reality around us, or that they do not want to admit the full truth to us at all. You can even say it is both. The media truly and honestly is the mouthpiece and queen on the chessboard for mass control. This is why on this episode of The Glass Prism, we will be exploring the concept of manufacturing consent, pioneered by Walter Lippmann, Noam Chomsky, and Edward Herman, about how your most personal thoughts might be plagued by another person's business or political agenda to make you think a certain way, how the elite wrote our history in the ways that suit them more so in the last century than any other time in recorded human history. Most of all, we will also discuss how to identify these tactics, the agenda and purpose of why and how it's applied, and how you can turn it around for your benefit in getting closer to an objective truth. This is the Glass Prism Podcast. Enjoy. Alright, if you were to reflect on all the information you have accumulated throughout your lifetime, even if you are particularly older, nowadays it's more likely than not that most of what you know was revealed to you through a screen, written by someone else. In an ideal democracy, that information would help you make your own decisions about your life that aid your well-being. Because, as you already may have inferred from the introduction, it is the set of intelligences and knowledge that you use to rationalize your decisions about who you are and what you believe. But what if the well of information we so heavily depend on is poisoned? And why is it so unbelievably hard to know if it ever were or consider alternatives? And if it were poisoned, are we truly living in a democratic reality? Before I continue for the rest of the episode, there are two key concepts that we need to understand to provide some context to this episode. First, talking about how information and the nature of information consumption has drastically changed for us in the last century, more than any other time in observable human history. I'm talking about a time when hunting wasn't a hobby for Joe Rogan enthusiasts, it was a necessity. Back then, the facts and the nature of information in the wild was solid. This means that if you see bear tracks, you can be pretty sure there's a bear in the vicinity and another animal hasn't somehow fake tracks or photoshopped the woods. If there's a rumor in the village you live in, authenticating information is also easy, and reputations of being known to tell lies and stories are very hard to erase, meaning identifying reliable sources of information was also relatively easier back then as well. Seeing was believing back then, and today our technology to create things and bring fiction to reality in unimaginable ways is remarkable, for better and for worse. Technologies such as deepfake, Photoshop, and social media algorithms that strengthen our carefully constructed worldview makes it more difficult than ever before to see the truth. The information today is far too easy to adulterate, but way too hard to evaluate critically time and time again. The point here is, biologically, we were not built to expend our cognitive resources into second-guessing the seemingly evident truths of the world. Nature has never forced us to guess whether the bear that you see in the forest is real or is it made out of cake, for example. Because one option sounds like a massive and delightful treat to find in the middle of a hunt, and the other one sounds like you are a treat to a very real and hungry bear. And unfortunately, this lack of preparedness in critically evaluating the truth about the reality around us made us incredibly susceptible to manipulation, which brings us to the second most important concept to understand. This concept relates to the scope of information required for us to consume today and how that has changed over human history. Unlike our past ancestors, the information that is directly meaningful and important to us is no longer about the gossip in our community and possibly neighboring areas. Our information is global. Think about that for a moment in the context of an ever-connected, globalized world. I mean, other than the fact that knowing what is going on in the world has some immediate merit about staying informed, your quality of life is now dependent on people around the world. You might have friends in Spain, your coffee might come from Central America, your electronics from China, and your faith possibly from the Middle East. You got chips on the table in all these areas, and it will affect both your mental health and your quality of life directly and indirectly with whatever you think is going on in any part of the world. Especially now that you most likely interact on a daily basis with people from everywhere on Earth, which in its own right is a remarkable and beautiful thing. But to make this possible, we fundamentally outsource our platform for connection and information about the world around us to a third party, the media. Fundamentally, this also means the role media plays in our lives today is as the connection between our isolated personal lives, which is everything we can see for ourselves, and the reality beyond the scope of our immediate surroundings in a different continent or country. Could you imagine how dysfunctional it could be for relationships to be strained by misinformation about the people and countries we interact with but rarely see ourselves? Some of you listening, particularly in marginalized communities, need not to imagine it at all. You are living it. This is because, unlike what I mentioned previously of how you can authenticate information yourself and be confident in who is a reliable source and unreliable source of information in a village a couple hundred years ago, in today's world, you cannot do that yourself. And even if you try to dispel your cognitive biases that have ingrained you into an ideology or antagonized you against a group of people, in a matrix of carefully curated facts, images, and statistics, you are led to believe so confidently that there is truly and honestly no possible way of thinking other than your own. To illustrate how our brains are susceptible to media manipulation, a Stanford Graduate School of Education study found that among 7,800 students across 12 states, among them Stanford students of course, examined how well these students can evaluate the credibility of information in their study, and the outcome of that study is, as the researchers put it, shocking to say the least. The results of that study demonstrated that the participants were more often than not careless with the origins of the photo evidence they were presented and rarely questioned whether they were tampered with. They even believed erroneous and/or manipulative facts and/or statistics with a high level of confidence in its validity simply because it was presented by a news article. They even failed to tell apart credible from uncredible sources. In case someone believes they are even smarter than those silly Stanford students, other studies show that intelligent people often convince themselves with sophisticated, self-manipulative tactics to believe in falsehoods, creating ever so delusional yet complex ideologies to what may be completely false, like how someone believing they are exceptionally smarter than those Stanford students. If that was you for a moment, don't worry, it meant you were smart enough to convince yourself. Anyway, The conclusion here is that you and I still rely on platforms that provide information for us and are even willing to be manipulated by it, even at a subconscious level, regardless of intelligence. By now, the true power of the media as a tool in modern democracies begins to materialize for you. And a certain group of powerful people were clued into this defect of our human brain and decided to use it against us. Those people realized whoever has the key to the platforms you look to get your information today has shaped your reality and will continue to do so. A simulated reality, by all means. This is how the elite and powerful manufacture your consent. Now, everyone listening to this podcast, no doubt, already knows about social media algorithms and how they manipulate people and all that jargon. I won't bore you by that over-milk topic because I want to tell you it's not social media that's the problem, it's media, period. And this problem of media manipulation was identified a full century ago, in 1922, by a journalist of all people by the name of Walter Lippmann. Lippmann was a distinguished journalist in the 20th century that hypothesized the public opinion theory in 1922, claiming that society cannot evaluate the public issues facing them rationally because of the oversimplification and speed of information thrown at them, forcing the media to emphasize slogans, interpretations of what the truth really is. Lippmann thinks this leads to a pseudo-democracy, a democracy where people make decisions based on what little they truly know, with the full confidence that they understand things as they really are in the world. In short, the media deliberately manipulates the masses because they underestimate people's capacity to understand the truth, not even considering the potential of this being abused. The media, of course, defends itself against the criticism with the same defense to this day, arguing that from a practical viewpoint, you cannot offer an individual too much information for them to understand or has time to read or care about. The media would not be able to garner enough attention in the masses that way, simply because of our constant need to be entertained by what is relevant and shocking. In short, the media has more confidence in their pet goldfish paying attention to honest yet complex world affairs than they do with us. So they dumb it down, make it short and sweet, fit a narrative to ensure continuity and consistency in their reporting, and then publish it. Not out of intention to deceive, but rather inform our limited capacity minds with what is truly important. All of this sounds dandy at first, until you realize that the flaws of our media status quo is not a result of practicality and short attention spans, an excuse that when the media is criticized for its operations, it has ready tied up in a neat ribbon. I mean, I cannot imagine a more condescending, you cannot handle the truth-esque argument than to believe the masses are too stupid to care. Noam Chomsky, one of the leading political commentators, linguists, and cognitive scientists of the 20th century, developed a theory regarding the evolved purpose of the media as a tool of control in modern democracies. He and Edward Herman argued that in reality, the media are the orchestral puppet strings and the elite the puppet masters to all of us. In their famous book, Manufacturing Consent, they talk about a model they created to explain the 5 filters of media and the agents within the model. Inspired by Lippmann, the book discusses how the elite selects topics to cover, how to distribute concerns and keep people distracted, and how much to emphasize certain topics to manufacture subconscious truths in people's minds. For what purpose, you may ask? Well, because much like how a parent must filter for their child what they view and deem appropriate, we are what Chomsky and Herman call the bewildered masses in the eyes of the elite, a lost majority of people who need guidance. In this reality, the filter becomes the truth. The narrative written by the elite becomes history that is written for others to read. The elite fundamentally writes history on behalf of everyone, and at times, like in the pandemic, they disagree morally and practically about what people should know and what is the history that should be written about who's right and who's wrong about every minute detail. These tactics of control are concocted through 5 media filters. The first is control of ownership. The media companies are owned by parties who have interests in making money and also have their money seeded in multiple different businesses like oil and gas companies, tech companies, entertainment companies, and even capital fund companies, and most of all, political and government interests. Media today is not owned locally. In fact, there is a coalition of a handful of media companies that get the most traffic owned by massive wealthy companies and families, examples of which include Rupert Murdoch, Disney, Warner Media, AT&T, Comcast, and a class of other families such as the Roberts family, Newhouse family, Benioff, and others. And they have effectively consolidated the media and captured the majority of the eyes and ears of the entire Western population. This majorly influences the stories journalists tend to report on and ultimately what we end up viewing. The concern lies in the fundamental conflict of interest, of the perceived purpose of the media, of reporting what is important, relevant, and true, and what the media is a tool for in modern democracies, in the hands of those who often have something to lose depending on the nature of the news being reported. We, the people, look to the media for education and to learn more about the world around us, and even help us form our political identities. If a coalition of big businesses and powerful families control this aspect of your life, they control your perception of reality with their interests ahead of yours. This brings us to the second filter of the media, which is advertising. If you ever wondered why the advertisements across news channels are different, now you will understand why. Because me and you, we are rarely media customers, but we are consumers, meaning we are the users, the audience of the media made available to true media customers, the advertisers. The media companies need to maximize profits. To do this, they need to appeal to advertisers who are looking for the largest audience they can find, and an audience that are particularly homogeneous, an audience that thinks alike so that their needs and what they're receptive to is what the advertiser is looking to sell. This incentivizes homogeneity in the news and narrative, and so now if Fox News audiences are mainly Trump supporters, then you know their employees definitely wear those MAGA hats unironically. Third is the official sources. The media recognizes it is difficult to gather information from everywhere. It decides to form a network of what the media company deems credible sources that inform the media of the happenings within a domain. This may be a government informant within the White House or someone in the front lines of a war. Those sources are part of the elite group of people and often are elected by the elite themselves to share the information they want to be shared. This means the source could possibly strategically feed incorrect information or consciously omit information in a biased manner. For the media, this source is close to where the action is, and oftentimes their best sources are keen to have media outlets compete for their attention and loyalty. That means they cannot afford to lose them, and the media will often go above and beyond to maintain positive relations with the source. The fourth filter in the media is elite flack. Being part of the elite is an exclusive club. It's a membership to fancy hotels, top secret information, private parties, and private Epstein islands. Those in the elite choose who can be in the elite. Given our globalized world where information is key and there are platforms that incentivizes people to take their own initiatives regarding information procurement and distribution, sometimes it is hard to avoid other voices and narratives, whether that be from small individuals or other politically motivated groups. Governments and corporations will make themselves exclusive in an attempt to appear more credible, so that only if your voice aligns with theirs will you be allowed into their club and their successes. And if you stray away, you get flack. If it's inconvenient for them, they will discredit sources as fake news or divert the media, such as, let's look at what Kim Kardashian is up to. Think how Fox News denies climate change because Rupert Murdoch, the owner of Fox News, Wall Street Journal, and many other media companies, has interests and key investments in oil and gas companies. You might think to yourself, well, I have a very good grasp of the reality around me because, for one, I don't watch Fox News. The left is not safe either. CNN and MSNBC also have their hands and interests in left-wing political parties and often switch moral positions and sometimes blatantly lie in their news. These news channels, for example, do not often criticize when the politicians of the party they have the strongest affiliation to do something wrong, in fear of flack from their associated party. For example, when some within that party openly practice insider trading when they themselves write policy to regulate the companies they invest in. Nancy Pelosi. Therefore, the news and all of its constituents understand they must appease the elite on their table. This, of course, leads to multiple, very clearly politically skewed media selection and manipulation tactics all media companies practice. Finally, the last filter is to create a common enemy. Creating a common enemy offers multiple advantages to the elite who control the media. If the elite deem a party disadvantageous to their interests, they will scrutinize and then villainize that party, and then gain enough support for the elite to act without consequence against them. The US's horrific war crimes of invading Iraq, destabilizing the country, and robbing it of its riches, and then celebrating their efforts to, quote-unquote, save America, is an example. They dehumanized the people of Iraq, even though the 9/11 attacks were not concocted by the Saddam regime, all under the guise of fighting terror and stopping the weapons of mass destruction that never existed. Entire regions of the Middle East were destabilized and saw airstrikes and family members die and suffer to this day. Only in the future would we look back at all the horrors that the largest military powers on this earth have committed against the vulnerable people abroad under false pretenses of moral superiority. Most of all, creating a common enemy serves as a way to distract people from attacking the elite by painting a more pertinent enemy other than themselves. So now that you know about these tactics and how virtually all media companies are guilty of mass manipulation, does this mean we live in a world of lies? I mean, what can we do to change this? Does this mean you should abolish your beliefs of the world and isolate yourself entirely? Well, most recently, independent journalists and media groups started to emerge, which helps introduce a new and exciting side of modern-day journalism that covers the stories or perspectives the legacy media rarely touches. Even though, admittedly, many of these independent media companies rarely will be able to generate primary sources that they themselves can entirely substantiate before reporting their stories. Though, this is still a very phenomenal start that the internet was able to offer those who truly care about the truth. As for everyone else, we should support transparent reporting and hold all media outlets accountable along the way to encourage objective and moral journalism. And for the time being, my advice is to introduce a healthy level of skepticism in all areas of knowledge. To put it simply, all you need to protect yourself is to acknowledge that all forms of media have an agenda. All political parties have an agenda. Every entity that has a message has a bias drawn into the message consciously and subconsciously. This is why the best way to combat misinformation is to not only seek reliable information in different perspectives, but to make a conscious effort as to not be drawn into any conclusion without being open-minded to the undeniable truth that what you are seeing is only part of the story. So hear out all the liars and whistleblowers and the truth preachers by subscribing to multiple different news channels to get a sense of what people disagree about and what it is they agree on. This will give you an opportunity to parse out the truth from the bed of lies they set to trap you into their ideologies. Another key to keep in mind is to be self-aware when a news article evokes an emotional response, especially when it seemingly holds the moral high ground. The media will try to keep you engaged by playing towards your emotions. Be very wary whenever this is the case. And finally, never forget that the majority of people around the world are good-hearted and peace-loving people. Those who are doing harmful acts feel righteously convicted because they are motivated by negative emotions and fear. To avoid being part of the problem, seek truth, and do not grant anyone access to your mind and your emotions, because ultimately, no one can impact you if not for your cooperation. This was the Glass Prism Podcast. I wish you all the very best. We appreciate your continued support, reviews, and shares. We love you. Goodbye.